Welcome to Learn at Work, a webinar series presented by the journal Work, a journal of prevention, assessment, and rehabilitation. In 2018, we are collaborating with the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society, and we'd like to thank them for being part of this exciting webinar series. I'm Karen Jacobs, the founding editor of Work, and I'll be your moderator today. I'm going to turn over the webinar now to our speaker, Steve. It's all for you.
Okay, welcome. My name is Steve Stern. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Pittsburgh at Johnstown. I'm glad to give this talk. I was glad to hear that it's in part sponsored by Human Factors folks, because this to a large extent fits in well in the world of human factors. I'm, however, not a typical human factors guy, nor am I a rehabilitation psychologist. I came to this line of research on computer synthesized speech as a run-of-the-mill social psychologist, interested in things like persuasion and attitude change. My original area of endeavor was actually as a social psychologist studying how changes in technology led to changes in social interaction. And so eventually, not eventually, but early in my career, I made an acquaintance with John Mullenix, who was a cognitive psychologist who studied computer synthesized speech and whether it was intelligible and understandable and whether people were able to distinguish between different syllabi. And discussing that with him, I realized that there'd been no work on social perceptions, or very little work on social perceptions of computer synthesized speech. I'll describe in a few minutes how that leads me to this more nuanced and I guess esoteric or small area of speech generating devices can improve perceptions of qualifications for skilled verbal and interactive jobs. I'd like to, of course, point out that it takes many people to do these studies. Typically, I work with undergraduate researchers, so we've got some who've gone on to bigger and brighter things. I also want to dedicate this to the most well-known user of computer synthesized speech or speech generating device, the recently late Stephen J. Hawkins, and also dedicate this to one of my actors, one of my hired hands, Andy, who was one of the people who, by talking to me and with me and working with me a little bit, gave me the best insight into why this type of work is valuable. It's never a bad idea to start off by pointing out that I think it is important that we continue to work on issues of disability and employability and hiring. And so I don't think these statistics will surprise anyone who would tune into this type of a webinar. But the concerns are that if we look at the employment rate of people of typical working age, we find that first off, people with disabilities are employed at only 32 or 3%, at least when this data was collected, I believe in the last census. People with complex communication needs, meaning people with speaking disabilities and other disabilities that would affect communication, are even half that in terms of their level of employment. And in case you're like, well, maybe it's just a whole lot of unemployment all around in this day and age, actually the baseline should be 73.6. But once again, it's never a surprise that any disadvantaged group would have a higher level of unemployment, especially a disadvantaged group, many of whom actually are unable to work because of their level of disabilities. But nonetheless, I think that even beyond that explanation, one explanation is logistical barriers to employment, even getting to jobs. If we can do our jobs, we are pretty much certain that there's stigmatization. Well, we know that there's stigmatization of disability. And so I think that there's still some discomfort in hiring people with disabilities. And I would argue that there's a good deal of bias, explicit bias. People are uncomfortable. Some people are open about their discomfort with people with disability, and implicit bias, people who would never tell you or would never recognize in themselves that they have a bias, but might still nonetheless be biased. Throughout my career, and particularly once I started studying computer synthesized speech, or as we're calling it in this particular context, speech generating devices, I like to point out that technology can play a positive role. Assistive technology are technologies that are designed to make it possible for people with disabilities to do things that they otherwise could not do. However, one thing that we find in my research is that the particular assistive technology that we're focusing in on here, computer synthesized speech, unfortunately is not well liked by people without disabilities. They don't like the way it sounds. They tend to derogate not just the sound, but they see, when they know that somebody's using it, they think less of them, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes as well. So it seems to be that a person can be on the horns of a dilemma when they have a stigmatizing disability, and there's a technology out there that should help them with that disability. But on the other hand, the technology itself is also disliked. To make sure we're all on the same page here, I'd like to talk a minute about what we're calling speech generating devices. It never helps when there's a million different terms in the literature, but there are a million terms in the literature, and as I speak, you'll see some of these things pop up. When I first started writing about this stuff, at least in the psychological literature, we frequently called it computer synthesized speech. If you wanted to be more specific and talk about the type of synthesized speech systems that people with disabilities used, where they used either a head wand to poke at a computer, or in some way input onto a keyboard and then have that keyboard speak, we'd call it a text-to-speech system. If you look at computer synthesized speech and add it to some other technologies that help people communicate, we often use the term augmentative and alternative communication. Some research articles refer to these things by their names. One of the more commonly used text-to-speech systems or computerized speech systems is the well-known Deck Talk, which was championed for a long time by Stephen J. Hawking. And there's probably some other terms out there. I also like to point out that these things are feasible workplace accommodations, that people have gotten jobs they otherwise wouldn't be able to do unless they had some sort of accommodation. So if you look through the literature on workplace accommodations for people with complex speech needs, you'll find that there have been teachers, counselors, journalists, contract negotiators. So people who really do need to talk have been able to talk through technology and to do their jobs. It is a feasible workplace accommodation. As I mentioned before, unfortunately, it's not well liked, and there might still be barriers to hireability, but there should not be too many barriers to actually doing the job. I also like to point out that the development continues of these things. So I have a picture here, I think my arrow shows, of a head wand, a 1980s, 1990s type of approach to poking at a keyboard or a screen. However, nowadays eye tracking can be used for people who are not able to use their arms and their hands. And so there's development continuing in terms of eye tracking, in terms of the types of interfaces that are used, in terms of the portability of these interfaces and the complexity of these interfaces, in terms of banking one's terms and one's requests and one's things that they want to say. And so in terms of speech quality, in terms of input capacities, in terms of our understanding of how to implement these technologies for people with disabilities, these things advance. I'd like to, at this point, give us some background into just how did we get to this particularly specific topic of the hireability of people with disabilities using speech generating devices. Often when I'm teaching my students research methods in psychology, I point to them that we all have some tiny little area that we've made our own. And sometimes I'm fairly surprised at how tiny an area I've managed to find my way into. But I did get there one step at a time. As I mentioned before, I was generally interested in technology and social interaction. In the late 1990s or mid 1990s to late 1990s, I started working specifically on the perceptions of and persuasiveness of computer synthesized speech or speech generating devices. In that case, we were doing simple 2-group or 3-group between groups designs in which we'd have people listen to a persuasive appeal given by a person using their own natural voice, or the other group might watch the very same person typing into a computerized speech system that was outputting, or at least appeared to be outputting, a 5-minute persuasive appeal. In that particular case, we almost always found, not surprisingly, that people did not like the speech generating device as much as they liked the person speaking with their natural voice. They did not like the message, nor did they like the person delivering it. So they derogated all 3 of these. Following on that research, we started adding in other variables, such as whether or not the person using the computerized speech had a disability. Well, that gave us some encouraging findings. It was found that as much as people disliked synthesized speech, as we'd found in our earlier research, we found that if the research participants were alerted to that the person was using it to overcome a disability, in that case, that negative effect almost pretty much, though not entirely, but almost disappeared. And so it was nice that people were at least forgiven the use of an assistive technology, even if that assistive technology was grating and disliked. Then we started to add other variables, and unfortunately that effect that we talked about here suddenly starts to dissipate. So we start to add other conditions. One condition we added was whether or not the person using synthesized speech was using it for a good purpose or a purpose that was less than good. The purpose that was less than good was simply if they were using it for a telephone campaign. And we know that people generally do not like to be approached with a persuasive appeal on the telephone, particularly a persuasive appeal that might come from a computer synthesized speech. In that particular case, we found that if a non-disabled person used the synthesized speech for a telephone campaign, that might not be well liked, but it wasn't particularly badly received. However, if a disabled person who would need that technology was using that technology for the same irritating purpose, then they were rated particularly poorly. And so essentially what we found was that when disabled people with disabilities used the synthesized speech for a negative task, then they were rated particularly harshly. And so the forgiveness for using the synthetic speech to compensate for the disability disappears when people have something else to blame their dislike of the disabled person using the technology. Around 2008, 2009, 2010, me and my colleagues took a little bit of a turn and started looking at stereotypes of people with disabilities, whether with speech disability, with a physical disability. And that's going to play a role here because we confirmed a handful of stereotypes, that some of which were in the literature, some of which were not well defined in the literature. But what we found was that people with disabilities were stereotyped as asexual, as isolated, as dependent, as unappealing, as entitled, feeling that they deserved more than others, and as typically unemployed. And so that'll play a role. In the last several years, we started looking at how people responded to films of bona fide people with disabilities using their own natural speech, their own natural and I realize I have a little mistake on that slide. It should say natural dysarthric speech versus computer synthesized speech. And so I'll correct that on the final version, or I'm just correcting it verbally at this point. And what we found there was that as much as people dislike computer synthesized speech, they particularly don't like when people with a disability, even a mild disability, use their own natural speech. And that's what moved us towards the study that I'm going to be discussing from, in this presentation, which is looking at the issue of hiring. So to summarize, our findings on attitudes towards speech-generating devices in a nutshell is people dislike speech-generating devices. They dislike the sound of it, they dislike the message, and they give low ratings to the person delivering it. However, it appears to be tolerated if the person using it has a disability. But that tolerance only goes so far. And in fact, it dissipates if there's ambiguity, if there's other factors, such as if the person with a disability is using it for a reason that we would prefer that nobody were to do. And finally, speech-generated device is preferred over natural speech of a person with a mild disability. This brings us to the current research questions. In the study that I'm going to be describing here, we tried to examine whether the biases against people with speech disabilities translated to biases regarding hiring. We looked at job-related variables that we would expect to matter in this case. So for instance, whether or not somebody's using a speech-generating device versus using their own voice, we would think that how complex or how skillful the job is would be an important variable. We would expect the verbal demands of the job to be an important variable. Another important variable would be whether or not the job required interaction between people. And interaction between people does happen in a variety of ways in a modern context. And so the modality of interaction, face-to-face versus computer-mediated communication versus using a telephone. To study this, we parsed it out, or I should actually say we did one study, then another, and then another, each one spurring us on to another research question. So I'm going to be discussing 3 separate studies, but they're all conducted almost identically. And so I'd like to talk in general at this point. For each study, we had to create a different set of independent variables. So for each study, we created a job checklist or a job rating sheet. We would first, and this isn't part of the study, but would be part of the preparation for the study, we would start off with a large list of jobs, usually twice as many jobs as we were going to need for the study, and have each of those jobs rated in terms of the variables of interest. So we would have an assortment of students, undergraduate students, rate a list of jobs in terms of how skillful they appeared and how much verbal ability was needed. And then once we had those ratings, we were able to then sort them based upon the ratings of these students. And so, for example, during the study, participants are going to be looking at a list of jobs and rating whether or not they would view somebody as hireable for those jobs. I'll show you, for instance, here's for study 1, here's what that job list was. As you can see, there are things which are skillful, such as a mental health rehabilitation specialist or an administrative assistant. There are things that are not very skillful, such as dishwasher. There are certain things that involve being verbal though they might not be skillful, such as being a greeter. So here we have a sample job list. This is what we used for study 1. For studies 2 and 3, we had different job lists based upon the variables we were interested in studying. And we made sure that on these job lists, we were covering the variables that we were concerned with for that particular study. So in study 1, we were looking at 2 variables, skillfulness and verbal demands of the job. And so we have 3 that are low skill and low verbal, 3 that are low skill and high verbal, 3 that are high skill and low verbal, 3 that are high skill and high verbal. And that way we were able to come up with scores for each of these 4 categories by aggregating these different levels of skill and verbal demand. So we're looking at this point at the dependent measure. So a job list is created for each study. The participants, and these are our sample sizes for the 3 studies, their introduction to psychology students, for better or worse. They're tested individually in private cubicle. The way that it works is that each participant watches a video of a person with a disability giving a persuasive speech. They might be doing it with their own voice, or they might be doing it using a speech generating device. They fill out one of those forms that you just saw. So they're rating that person on a measurement of higher ability. Then they watch a second video of a different person with a disability, either using their own voice or using a speech generating device. And finally, they complete the same measure for that person. So we have a within groups design here, which affords us more statistical power. Now let's talk about what the participants are looking at. We'll take a little look behind the scenes, our actors. One of the more enjoyable parts of this study happened a few years before we even did this particular study, which was the gathering of video clips of people with disabilities doing a variety of things. They were consumers from a local training and rehabilitation facility. And it's important to point out that they're paid as actors. They were not recruited as participants. And so for their time, through a small grant through our university, it was nice that we were able to pay them $100 to work with us and to act, to read different things, to act sometimes with a different disability than they might have. Most of them did not have speaking disabilities, but still, nevertheless, mime the part of a person that did. We filmed them over 2 days at a local studio. We asked them to do a variety of tasks and read a variety of texts. And to this day, I will probably never feel I've put these films to as much good use as I could. And I look forward to continuing to use this bank of video clips of people doing tasks that were easy for them, people doing tasks that were challenging, people reading different statements which are congruous, which are incongruous, people talking about things that are uncomfortable to listen to or that are uplifting to listen to. Okay. I like to point out that although all of these people do have disabilities, that most were not actual speech generating device users. Okay, that in cases where, as you can see in this upper corner here, we see somebody using a speech generating device. This person actually does not need one to communicate, and actually he's fairly easy to listen to. We boiled down our stimuli to films of 2 different actors, both who use wheelchairs to get around. The actor on the top was disabled by accident, through a car accident. The gentleman on the bottom was born with cerebral palsy. Neither of these guys have too much difficulty speaking. Fellow with cerebral palsy, maybe a little bit. You could tell if you were to listen to him on the telephone, you could tell that he might have a disability, but you would still be able to understand him quite clearly. And I think that's important to point out. So to sort of sum up, these guys were, and they are guys, recruited as actors, not participants from a local rehabilitation and training facility. Neither has a genuine speech problem. They have mild dysarthria at most. They both posed, meaning acted, using speech generating device for 5 minutes, and we dubbed in the computerized speech, and they both recorded a 5-minute persuasive appeal. That 5-minute persuasive appeal is an argument in favor of comprehensive exams in university teaching. They are, it is a standardized persuasive appeal that has been frequently used in social psychological research. And so it was a good thing for us to use from the point of view of being able to stick with stimuli that had been used many times before in literally hundreds, if not thousands, of studies on persuasion in the social psychological literature. So here's the general procedure, not to be redundant, but to make sure that we're on the same page. If you were a participant, like this avatar here, you would first watch a video of a person with a disability. Then you would complete a questionnaire, like I showed you before, on how hireable they would be for a number of jobs. Then you would watch a video of the other person with a disability, and then you would complete a second questionnaire. And so hence, we're talking a statistically powerful within groups design, and as I'll point out on the next slide, it's fully counterbalanced. Leave this up here for a second so that you can take it in, and here we go. And so we end up with all of the conditions. All participants see a person deliver with speech generating device or natural speech. Sometimes the speech generating device is presented first. Sometimes they listen to the natural speech first. Sometimes it's actor 1 using the speech generating device. Sometimes it's actor 2 using the speech generated device. And sometimes actor 1, the fellow with the Sublime t-shirt, presents first, and sometimes it's actor 2, the other fellow, speaking first. And so we're controlling for the order of speech type, speech generated device versus natural speech. We're controlling for the order of the actor, the fellow with the Sublime shirt versus the other guy. And we're controlling for any type of interaction that there might be by making sure to compensate for all potential orders, speakers, and whatnot. Now I will talk about what we did in each of the studies, or at least in how they differed. In the first study, we were interested in the extent to which these people would be seen as hireable for jobs that were low in skill versus jobs that were high in skill, as well as low in verbal ability, need for verbal ability versus high. And so as we saw in the job list previously, some jobs were rated, well, the jobs were all rated for each of these 4 categories. What we found was sort of a little bit discouraging for people who wish to use their own voice or who might have a disability and maybe they have a slight dysarthria, is that when people are in that particular group using natural speech, they're often pegged as being very qualified for these low verbal jobs, for jobs that we don't have to listen to somebody speak. Encouragingly, was that people using a speech generating device were seen as qualified more so than people using their natural speech for work that had a higher skill demand. The second study is conducted almost exactly is conducted the same exact way as the first study, but in the second study, we moved on from looking at just whether or not a job was verbal. We were interested in whether or not the job was interactive. So in that case, we had jobs that were pre-selected for their level of skill, as we did before, and skill remains a variable that is looked at in all three of these studies. But in this case, we looked at whether or not jobs were interactive, whether or not they were ones in which people would have to work with other people, whether or not that interactivity was mediated, whether they'd be using telephones and computers, or whether or not they would be non-interactive jobs where somebody could work alone, and whether or not they needed a high level of skill. So there are jobs in which we don't have to interact with people, but yet need high skill. And we have jobs that are interactive, where skill level matters. Here are our findings. Once again, these are the average hireability for each of the, in this case, 6 categories of jobs: interactive, non-interactive, interactive, and mediated, times low and high skill. And we see once again that when using their own speech, these people using their natural speech are not seen as the type of people you would want to hire for they are seen as people you would want to put in low skilled jobs, as well as not very interactive jobs. Okay, particularly low skill, not interactive. Speech generating device, however, does not seem to give you too much of an edge for jobs that are interactive. In fact, the more interactive and non-interactive seem to be just about the same. Finally, the third study, built off of the findings from these first 2 studies, looked at the ways in which, looked specifically at the mode of interaction. So face-to-face versus computer versus telephone. So here we have, once again, jobs sorted into each of these categories. And so here we're finding some things that are actually not all that surprising. We're finding that neither of these people are seen as being good for high-skilled jobs using the telephone. Low-skilled jobs using the telephone may be a little bit better. The findings that stick out are people using speech-generating devices are seen as better qualified for computer-mediated communication as opposed to the telephone or speaking face-to-face. So there is seen some potential bias against computers, against speech-generating devices for jobs in which people have to talk directly with people. Once again, most disconcertingly is that people using their natural speech, people with disabilities, are once again, seen as better qualified for the lower skilled work. That seems to be where they keep ending up in these studies. In some ways, these findings in general are encouraging. Okay, they imply that while this technology is disliked, it's perhaps less of a barrier to hiring decisions than if we do have to take into account the participants are not human resources people. We'd want to move towards that direction. But these findings imply that it might not be as big a barrier to hiring, or as our young participants might see people with disabilities. That said, we do see some biases that concern us about people using their own voices. So in summary, speech generating device users was rated as more hireable for skilled work than people with disability using their own voice. They were typically seen as more hireable for a verbal job and more hireable for jobs requiring communication, computer mediated communication. I do like to point out that no comparisons were made with people without disabilities. So we're only looking at people with disabilities using synthetic speech or not using synthetic speech. And that would make a more complete picture, but one that's beyond the scope of this paper. But I don't want us to forget that both of these groups are more than likely disadvantaged when compared to a control group, so to speak, or a group of participants who are rating people who have no evidence of disability. Questions that these findings raise include: do speech generating disabilities truly foster a better disability job fit for verbal jobs? We would hope that they do. They help give people who lack the capacity to speak the ability to communicate verbally, and ideally they should. However, we recognize that even still, most speech generating systems do not sound particularly natural, especially ones that permit text to speech on the fly. One question that's raised in this study that I think you've probably picked up on is that I'm concerned to the extent that even slightly dysarthric speech is highly stigmatizing, that when people use their own voices, even when those people's voices are able to be understood, and both of these participants were rated in pilot work, and they were both considered some pretty intelligible. Nonetheless, our participants did not respond to them all that well, and they tended to endorse them for the most unskillful of the jobs. Another question that's raised is the pragmatic question as well. From this research, as well as other things we know, should the users of speech generating devices be more integrated across the workforce? Should people who might not use speech generating devices or choose to use them less often than they do be more willing to use them? Should we be trying to find ways to get employers to be more open to having these people do jobs they otherwise would not consider them, such as in telephone work and other potential uses? I'm sure there are other questions that you might want to ask of me, or you might want to just raise in general. And so now I'm going to turn this webinar over to our audience and to our moderator.
Steve, thank you so much. That was so interesting. You know, I'm an occupational therapist and a board certified ergonomist. So, you know, listening to this really resonates with me. You know, one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, you know, what direction do you think you'll go? You know, you did quite a few studies here, but, you know, if you had sort of, and I'm going to make this fantasy up, unlimited unlimited funds, which, you know, we know is not a reality anywhere, what would you do next?
Okay, let me let you know what I have been working to do next, which works well with limited funds. And that's doing similar study to this one, a similar series of studies to this one, but instead of having people rate people on jobs, having them rate them on specific job tasks. Because I feel that a job in and of itself carries with it so much weight, and weight that our particular sample doesn't necessarily fully understand. And so that, you know, with our limited resources, I'd like to move in that direction. If I could, you know, if money wasn't an issue, I would be working with better samples. I'd be working with human resources people as participants, or I'd be working with managers as participants. I'd be working with I'd be hiring more people with disabilities to make stimuli that is more specific to this type of research, because the reason we're using the persuasive appeals is because that's what worked for the research I've been doing earlier, and that's what we had from our 2 days of filming people, and that wasn't an inexpensive endeavor. And so I'd go back into the studio and create more stimuli so that we'd be able to create more job interview like stimuli, mock job interviews in order to get better, more realistic stimuli.
Yeah, that sounds great. So when you're talking about job tasks, can you give some examples of what you would do?
So instead of just simply saying an administrative assistant, we might parse that to the tasks that an administrative assistant does. So answering telephones, delegating tasks to work study, filing material, word processing, so on and so forth.
So you'd probably look at the essential functions of a job.
Yes, in fact, we were looking at, we were using the Department of Labor type of job descriptions and lists to parse apart these jobs, to parse apart any number of jobs and come up with different type of tasks.
Yes, because ONET has, some could be a very good resource. I'd love to encourage you to work with an occupational therapist on this because they have expertise in breaking down the tasks. So not just what the job task is, but what are the performance demands that are made
That's
on the person.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that advice because I'm at that stage where I'd be looking into doing that. And on top of it, I think that would have great appeal. Many of our students who do research with us are actually looking to go into occupational therapy. And so for me to be able to work with a genuine OT person would probably be a benefit to not just the research, but to to my to my student researchers.
Great. Oh, thank you. Little PR for occupational therapy there. Another question I had, if we were to do a headline in a newspaper, what would be the headline and you can take any of your studies, that would appeal to the general public? What are sort of the punchlines here that would, you know, really help people turn around and take a second look?
Needless stereotypes continue to disadvantage people with disabilities. Maybe I think we like to believe we live in a fair world, and we like to believe that any unfairnesses in it are not of our own doing. But I think that we still live in a world in which our own biases transmit to other people's misfortune, and I think that we still need to work to diversify the workplace, and maybe one of the most challenging ways of diversifying the workplace is, and one that's sometimes is very resource intense, is disability. But in the meantime, these are people's livelihoods. They need a livelihood, and to exclude them from the workplace is a disaster, just for a person with a disability, just like a person without. And so I think that reminding people that this is still an issue, or that it is an issue, because I think it's invisible to a lot of people, would be the thing which I would broadcast.
Steve, this is such an important area, and dealing with stigma is an ongoing issue. I'd love a world where that didn't occur. So this has been an area of real interest for me for many years, and I actually started a few years ago writing children's books that have children and adults with different challenges in it, to help and to portray them accurately, so that people can see that a person with dementia can do this, or a person with CP can do this. And I'm hoping that starting young will help as we get older, and eventually in the workplace, that changing the stigma if you start at a young age. And of course, we've got to do it at all ages. So this has been near and dear to my heart, listening to your presentation.
Well, thank you, and I agree with you that starting at young ages, and even those young ages, could be working with university students to better teach them about the nature of discrimination, and about the possibilities in terms of people in the workplace, about the technologies that can make that even more of a possibility. But as well, the work with younger children is critical, because I think it's easy to pick up blanket assessments of what people are able to do and unable to do just from the limited environment that we're raised in. You mentioned people with dementia, and of course, I think children often pick up on misgivings of that from the adults around them who have not misgivings, misconceptions. There are misconceptions all around, and that sounds like good work as well.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So we're going to conclude in just a moment. Any last thoughts before we conclude this really interesting webinar?
No, I just appreciate the opportunity to give this webinar. I appreciate it because, one, it gives me an opportunity to reach a greater audience. I appreciate it as well because I'm not the most prolific author, but sometimes you can almost forget what you've worked on when it's been out for a while, and it gave me an opportunity to re-engage in my material and to refamiliarize myself with what I've done and to think about moving forwards on it.
Well, thank you, Steve, because I think this is really fascinating, and we're so happy that we were able to publish it in Work. And I want to thank everybody for listening today. Our Learn at Work series happens every month. I hope you will subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can listen to the recordings and pay it forward, tell other people about it. So thank you again, Steve, and thank you all for joining us today.
You're more than welcome.